Oh, well, hi there. Welcome to Liberty.me Live. This is Free Association. I'm Lucy Steigerwald. Over there is Sheldon Richman. And today we're going to talk about a book that seems awesome, but unfortunately, Mr. Sheldon Richman only sent me a PDF copy of it about 2 hours ago, so I have only delved a little bit into the introduction and the preface or what have you by Jeffrey Tucker, in which he calls Sheldon's book and his argument provocative, I believe. And you gotta love being called provocative by people. I feel like that's the classic way of saying that, whoa, there's some serious stuff in this book. I wasn't sure how you wanted to do this, Sheldon. You wrote the damn thing, so I might let you start things off.
Okay, I'll talk about it for just a few minutes, and then hopefully that will stimulate some tough questions on your part. Yeah, provocative is sort of a diplomatic way of saying outrageous.
No, but it's the intellectual diplomatic way of saying it. And I suspect Jeff Tucker.
No, that was a very nice forward. I've known Jeff a very long time, and he even discussed that at the end of the forward, the fact that we go back quite a ways to the 1980s. And I was very honored to have him praise the book, so we're pleased to have his name and have him associated with this book. He actually gave me a tip on the title, so the exact title.
And what is the title?
Is the result of a suggestion of his. And here's a copy of it. It's a real book, see? It's not very thick. It's not intimidating. I don't write intimidating books. I've written now 4 books. They're all about this length. I don't want people to say, I don't have time for that. Most people are busy and they don't get paid to read books. Nice work if you can get it. So it's a mere 140 pages or so. And some of that's, like kind of junk at the back, list of sources and things. It's called America's Counter-Revolution, the Constitution Revisited. The cover is a beautiful cover. It's a famous painting from back in that era of the signing of the Constitution. It's actually it's not the full painting. It's a much wider painting. That's detail of it. And featured right in the front there, which attracted my attention, are Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, and James Madison, all recognizable people who were instrumental in getting the Constitution passed. Anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about the book, why I wrote it. It's actually been 10 years in the making. Not that I've worked continuously on it, but in 2006, when I was doing my TGIF column, where it originated at the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org. And I actually began the column in 2006, so I started this soon after beginning the column. I don't know why exactly, I fell into doing occasional essays on revisionist history of the Constitution. And I did that all, over the 10 years. When I moved to the Future Freedom Foundation, I continued TGIF. TGIF, by the way, well, it comes out on Friday. It doesn't stand for Thank Goodness It's Friday. It stands for the goal is freedom. And of course played on the TGIF. And so I did a few more articles about the Constitution, again revisionist, upsetting the standard version that everybody gets. And then recently, in the last year, I wrote a couple more things. In fact, in the last 4 months or so, I wrote 4 essays. And it dawned on me I probably have enough to put this together if I add like an introduction and a concluding chapter. So there is new stuff, by the way. It's not all found. You can't find it all on online. And by the way, even the stuff you'll find online, I've kind of updated or expanded the chapters. So there's new material even in the interior chapters. So I thought maybe there's enough, and it turned out there was enough for a kind of, like I say, a reasonable-sized book that anybody could pick up. You don't even need to read it from beginning to end, because they are sort of individual essays, and while they have transitions between them, you can really dip in anywhere on a topic that interests you, a particular topic. It's not like just a continuous narrative, and it's not chronological even, it's topical. So the reason I was attracted to this, excuse us, I hope we're not interrupting your dinner. The reason I was attracted to this story is that I think history is very important, especially for young libertarians. I was kind of warned after I had a few of these out online, that I really should be careful because all people, all countries need, I was told, all countries need their fairy tales. And this was coming from a libertarian who was telling me this, like, you ought to be careful because why do you want to upset this? People sort of have a libertarian story in mind when they hear about the Constitution. They've learned it in school, and while that's not obviously that's not a pure libertarian story, they have the sense that these guys met in Philadelphia in 1787 between May and September in order to set up a limited government because they were just so fed up with the King of England and the Parliament that could tax them even though they weren't represented, and so they had a revolution and broke off from the British Empire. And the first thing they did was sit down and draw up this wonderful Constitution, which created a very limited government whose powers are, in the words of James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution, few and defined. There's a very key term that's in the Federalist Papers by Madison, invoked by conservatives and by libertarian constitutionalists all the time. Few and defined. So my belief, when I realized that actually wasn't exactly how things happened, I thought it was important that libertarians know this. I think it's important for anybody to know it, but one of the things I had in mind is, and I remembered my own experiences from college when I was a young libertarian, if you know libertarian theory, but you don't know that much history, and you start doing history a priori, you assume this is how it must have worked because I'm a libertarian, so therefore this is how it went. And then you go arguing with students or professors in college, you will get slaughtered by anybody who knows some history. And I know this through personal experience, and I've seen plenty of other libertarians as young libertarians, college students, fall for this. They think they know how history went. If you read a lot of Ayn Rand, you're going to get some distorted view of American history, and generally, this is what libertarians, I think, initially start out with. And they have a rude awakening when they meet someone who actually has studied history. And it can be very discouraging. I imagine there are some young libertarians who decided after their first humiliating experience, where they got bested in some historical point, probably maybe gave up, maybe said, this isn't for me, or at least I'm not going to talk about it. I may be a libertarian, but I don't need this aggravation, this humiliation. So I thought it was very important to tell libertarians, and everybody else actually, that there's a different story here, that the purpose of the Constitution, the founders, the framers, their goal was not primarily to protect liberty and create a limited government, because there's this 8-year period roughly between the end of the Revolution, not exactly that, and 1789, when the Constitution is ratified. There's this 8 years. What was going on during those 8 years? Well, it turned out there was a first Constitution, known as the Articles of Confederation. I don't remember learning that much about it. I guess we learned a little bit about it, how, things were a mess, so they had to jump to the Constitution. That was basically what we got. I don't know what they teach these days. But when you look at the Articles of Confederation, which you can find online, I probably should have put it in the back of the book, the central I call it quasi-government for reasons which will be clear in a moment. The central quasi-government had no power to tax and no power to regulate trade, and it lacked a lot of other powers, like the power to impose intellectual property laws. Unlike the Constitution, there's no reference to patents and copyrights. It lacked a lot of other powers. Now, it wasn't. It had some powers. As a libertarian, I agree with Murray Rothbard. It had too much power. But when you look at it today, you'd be amazed that they had this thing which could not tax and could not regulate trade. Now, how did it get its money? It would issue requisitions to the states, and the states, of course, had the power to tax, so they would raise money occasionally and send in the money. I think more often they called up and said the check is in the mail, and it didn't ever show up. So they had the power to tax. So that's why I call it a quasi-government. I think taxation is really an essential feature of government. And so the Confederation Government, which which consisted of a Congress, basically, and that was it. It was a one-branch government. There was no separate executive and no separate judiciary. It relied on tax money, but only secondarily. It couldn't tax. Now, there were people who right along said, well, maybe we ought to give it some small independent taxing power, like a 5% tariff, and some power to regulate trade. But under the rules, you needed unanimous consent of the 13 states for any amendment to the articles to be approved, and they never could get it. Some state, Rhode Island, Virginia, New York, would hold out when a tax proposal was made. And so it was constant frustration to the people that wanted a stronger central government in order to regulate trade, in order to promote trade. In other words, they weren't laissez-faire advocates. They were mercantilists. Promote trade, tax the people, and do a whole bunch of other things they want to do. Have a standing army. Very important to have a standing army. And so there was this movement, I won't go through all the details, this movement to get a convention called. And finally, the Confederation Congress issued a declaration that there shall be a convention in Philadelphia beginning in May 14th, I think, 1787, specifically and only exclusively for the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation, which, again, I remind you, would require unanimous ratification by the 13 states. They get to Philadelphia. The state legislatures pick people to go to Philadelphia. They talk George Washington, who was the most popular man of the country, to go, and they make him the president of the convention. They lock the doors so the public couldn't get in. They don't take any official notes, although Madison and a few others took notes, and you can find notes, but there was never a published official record of what went on. And then they changed, and then they tore up the Articles of Confederation, started over with a brand new plan that created a strong central government, the one we live under today. And then they also changed the rules of ratification. Instead of unanimous consent, it says there must be only 9 states need to consent, and then there's going to be this new Constitution, this new United States under this Constitution. If a state didn't consent, it wasn't forced into. If it didn't ratify, it wasn't forced into the Union, but the Union would set up among the states the 9 or plus or more that ratified. And so special state conventions, not the state legislature, special state conventions were set up, and the people voted to send delegates to them. There was a huge fight. It's very interesting, fighting over political philosophy. Actually, very interesting debate. And I won't go, again, we'll leave the details for the discussion. The Constitution eventually gets, of course, ratified. And
spoiler alert.
Yes, sorry, did I blow it? And then in 1789, of course, we have elections, and George Washington. Everybody figured George Washington was going to be the first president, and he was. Now, there was a whole group, the Anti-Federalists, who opposed ratification. A lot of them did. Some of them would accept ratification if there were some changes to the structure of the government in the Constitution. So they wanted amendments before it was ratified, or they wanted a promise of amendments after it was ratified. But some didn't want it at all. Some wanted to just fix the Articles of Confederation. These were the Anti-Federalists, although they were the true Federalists, if you think about it. The others were really nationalists or centralizers. And they made very powerful arguments. They said the taxing power was unlimited, and I think history has pretty much borne that out. They said the standing army is dangerous. I think they were right about that. They complained about the power of the presidency and the Senate, and they made a lot. They thought the necessary and proper clause was an elastic clause, a blank check. They thought the general welfare clause was a blank check, and the supremacy clause was a blank check. They had a whole list of and then to boot they said, and there's no Bill of Rights. So I think they were very prophetic. Maybe their most extreme predictions didn't come true, but a lot of what they said did come true, and we can flesh that out as we go. So that's what it's about. It's the real story.
I have many questions, as usual. One of them that just comes to mind is that was there anyone in particular who defended the Articles of Confederation as somehow like, well, we're good now? I mean, you say they wanted, to tweak things, but was anyone passionately devoted to that particular document? If
so, that person's, I think, lost in history. I don't come across I'll say he because obviously these are all men. That's the way it was. I have not come across someone who said, no, it's just fine the way it is. In fact, if you read books about the Articles of Confederation, or I'm sorry, about the Anti-Federalists, you find that they agreed that some fixes needed to be made. They weren't against giving the national government, the Congress, under the Articles, some small, limited, independent power to tax, like a 5% tariff or impost, as they called it in those days, or perhaps an excise. But the people pushing those things, they didn't want just a narrow thing. That was going to be just a foot in the door. People like Robert Morris and Madison, they wanted the full taxing power. And you can see the kind of taxing power that they got in the Constitution. So the answer is no. I don't come across anyone who says it's fine the way it is. Let's not give it the power to tax. Let's not give it the power to regulate and promote trade, unfortunately.
This is one of those things that, as usual, I feel vaguely chastised that I ever fancied myself as someone who knows something about history. Well, this is not my era usually, I admit, but thinking back on sort of even as a homeschooler who spent a huge amount of time reading history books, I read my general history books. I read A History of Us by Joy somebody. And I just powered through those, and in retrospect, I think that's where there's a lot of bad stuff in there. I think I seem to recall a passage being awfully light on Wilson, things like that.
Yep.
But to generalize, I feel like any book like that, any general history, tends to go the Revolutionary War, and then George Washington, and some people said he should be king, and he said, no, I don't want to be king, and then he was president, and then they have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and nothing happened until, say, the War of 1812, which probably warrants a sentence or two. I mean, that's the problem with a general history. But this sure seems more important in retrospect than. No,
there was a great debate. It was a great debate. Unfortunately, there wasn't a hardcore libertarian or much less anarchist. And I talk about that a little bit in the introduction, about what that was missing, and that, I don't just say that because, hey, people like me weren't there. It meant the debate was not nearly as complete as it could have been. You do have somebody like Thomas Paine, who, well, maybe he was a secret anarchist, I don't know, but he says things that are quite anarchistic, and I have the quote actually a couple times in the book where he says in his great work, Rights of Man, which is already 1790, I think, so it's kind of too late for that debate. But he says the great part of the order of society has nothing to do with the state whatsoever. It's a brilliant passage. You can find it. It's online too. I've quoted it a lot of times. And he spells it out. He talks about how it's in the natural constitution of human beings that gives rise to order. Both because of the self-interest and trade and things like that. It's a beautiful passage. But he didn't obviously fully grasp it because he thought government was a necessary evil. So that is missing from the debate. It makes it a lot less satisfying. And I think given the way the two sides were arrayed, the Anti-Federalists were kind of fated to lose the debate because they gave away too much. They shared too many premises. I quote a line from Ayn Rand in an essay she did on compromise, where she said, in any conflict between two people who share the same premises, the more consistent will win. In any argument, the more consistent will win. And the people called the Federalists, the Nationalists, were unfortunately they were the more consistent because the other side was not rejecting the state and taxation. And other coercive powers.
Now, to me, another important question is, would things have been improved had they kept the still dubious Articles of Confederation? I mean, is there something? I don't know. I guess I think your book premise invites, at least initially browsing the back of it, it invites the question of, well, are you saying, so what if? I mean, what could have been, if this hadn't occurred?
I I don't explicitly take up that angle, although there's some hints about that, because one of the things I construe the Constitution, I think it can be construed this way, as a cartelizing device, because this is an old story. The reason decentralization, if they're going to be governments, the reason decentralization is preferable to centralization, smaller jurisdictions is preferable to one big one, is that you get, first of all, it's cheaper to vote with your feet, right? It's cheaper to exit. And that itself, the potential to exit, it's hard to leave your country, especially if it's a big country, because that's a bigger disruption of your life. It's easier to leave your town, and it's maybe a little harder, but it's still easier to leave your state. So that introduces competitive forces at that point. It should, or at least it should. And states will to some extent limit the burdens of taxation and regulation and other kinds of government impositions if people can more or less easily leave. They can flee. If you set up a national state, which is what the Constitution did, with overarching powers to tax, regulate, trade, and things of that nature, now you've taken these individual jurisdictions, which were to some extent competing with each other. Now you've turned them into a cartel, a coercive cartel, and we know it's a coercive cartel because remember what happened when some of the members of the cartel tried to leave in 1861. Mr. Lincoln, I'm jumping way ahead in history now. Mr. Lincoln said, we're not going to let you do that. So now let's get back to the 1780s. It was a cartelization. And so I think that's a very good way to look at it. There was competition among the states, which was even lowering tariffs, because the states did maintain tariffs against European goods. But this was a way to, and this was explicit. I mean, they say it. This was a way to have a single uniform trade policy, a single uniform taxing policy. And they wanted to reduce the states, as John Jay put it, to mere counties. They wanted to make them like counties in the states. The states would be like counties with respect to the national government.
I will say that I get the sense that the states were still looked at as closer to independent than they are today, and closer to that than they have been since, well, obviously the Civil War, but also since I'm forgetting the term for when the courts finally said, oh, all this stuff applies to the states as well in the Constitution, which occurred bizarrely in the 1960s. There's a word for it, and I'm blanking on it.
Incorporation.
Yes, thank you.
Through the 14th Amendment, and they said that, I don't know if this has not been definitively spelled out, but generally the Bill of Rights is considered applicable to the states.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, because don't forget the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say anything about state legislatures.
It's true.
So, what was I going to say? Something you said jogs on. Well, keep going. I lost the thought.
Well, just that something did change along the way, and sort of the cartelization became obviously more and more extreme. It still feels like there was a different, or maybe this is just part of the old story I've been told, where they were still looking at the states as somewhat sovereign, if loosely stitched together.
Well, they're named individually in the Treaty of Paris with the King of England. So they were regarded as sovereign states, and the Articles of Confederation speaks of them that way. The Constitution, of course, begins with the words. The preamble begins with what? 3 earth-shaking words for the Anti-Federalists: "We the people,"
right? Not
"We the states." So Patrick Henry, who was a leading Anti-Federalist, and others immediately said, "Wait a second. So this is a consolidated system." That was the dirty word in their lexicon. This is going to be a newly consolidated system, and not a league of friendship, which is a term from the Articles of Confederation, among sovereign states. Henry says, "What is this 'we the people'? I don't understand this." And Samuel Adams said, I try to enter the building, namely the structure, and I trip over the threshold," meaning the first 3 words trips him. Why does it say "we the people"? And it was all downhill from there as they read, because they realized this is a radical change. And don't forget, they went to Philadelphia under the impression that they were only going to amend the Articles of Confederation. And one of the famous anti-federalists, I forget who it is now, they used pseudonyms. Of course, so do the Federalist Papers authors also used the pseudonym, pen name Publius. I think it's the anti-federalist Brutus who says, if we knew that they were not going to amend the articles but start all over, we never would have sent delegates.
Oh.
So they felt they had been snookered.
Yeah.
And if you've ever read Albert J. Knox's book, great book, 1935 book, Our Enemy the State, he talks about all this.
Such a good title.
And he calls it a coup d'etat. He says what happened in Philadelphia in 1787 was a coup. And I don't think that's exaggerated.
I haven't read that yet. My father has an old copy of it, and I've admired the title greatly. I haven't actually read it. Knock. Oh man, I had a good historical question for you.
But you forgot it?
Well, there's the humongous question, which you invite by putting ye old Lysander Spooner quote right at the beginning of your...
And I meant to quote that. Well, it seems to me he's issued libertarians a challenge, as well as everybody else, but especially limited government libertarians a challenge. Spooner, of course, was an anarchist. And he says at the end of his great essay, The Constitution of No Authority, which you can find online. I almost put it at the back of the book, but I thought, it's online. It's everywhere. He says, one thing, whatever the Constitution may be, he attacks it as he says it's not a contract, it couldn't bind future generations. He goes through all this at great length, and it's wonderful, charming reading. He was this cantankerous, old constitutional lawyer, constitutional scholar, and a lot of other things, abolitionist, businessman. Tried to compete with the U.S. Post Office until they shut him down.
Yeah.
He did many things. His beard was a lot longer than mine. But he said at the end of the Constitution of No Authority, he says, whatever it may be, one thing is clear: either it authorized the government we have, or it was powerless to prevent it. Whichever is the case, it's unfit to exist.
And he was writing this in 1840 something?
No, in the 1880s.
80, okay, yeah.
That's pretty late in his life.
Yeah.
1887, maybe, I think.
Okay. I always put him a little earlier in my brain.
He was writing in the 1840s, but not that. He didn't write that. That was later.
And you think of the tyranny that he was railing against then. I mean, well, slavery, we had slavery, but then we have, fundamentally, the government is larger part in more people's lives today, so. And you can't even dispute that. I mean, how do you argue against that statement? It's great, because he's covered all of his bases.
Right, and this is supposed to be the goal, for a lot of people, a lot of libertarians, this is the golden age.
Mm-hmm.
The 1880s, the post-Civil War up to the Progressive Era, or wherever you want to date that, 1900, just for sake of picking out a number, that's supposed to be the golden era, the Gilded Age, the wonderful time when there was no income tax. I hear incessantly, there was no income tax, there was no Social Security, there was no Medicare. Why is Spooner complaining about it? Why were other people like Benjamin Tucker complaining about it? It wasn't just that they were anarchists. They weren't just saying, oh, no, I'm an anarchist and therefore any government I can't tolerate. They pointed to major violations. Usurpations is one of the favorite words, right? We don't hear that word enough these days.
No,
you got to go back to that time. Major usurpations against individual liberty. Spooner, by the way, was not only an abolitionist, but he opposed the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
He knew the government would grow from it. He thought it was immoral that Lincoln could go and make war on other states, even though he thought slavery was a very bad reason to secede. In fact, he used to try to foment slave revolts himself. I
didn't know that.
to get free whites who didn't own slaves to join them. He'd go and put posters on trees trying to foment slave revolt. So he was a serious guy. He was an activist. He wasn't an armchair theorist.
No, man, I didn't know that part.
This era is beyond my books. We need to jump back to the 1780s.
I know. But I also love, I'm going to say, Spooner's Against Women's Suffrage essay, which is which has that like what the hell title, and then it just says, and this is a couple decades earlier. It just says women are equal to men in every way, basically, but voting is ridiculous.
Well, he says something like he's saying women should have the same right to vote as men, namely none at all.
Right? Yeah. It's good right there. I'm for that. All right. So, what of Spooner's sentiments? I mean, I guess I don't want to circle back to the what if question, but I still am kind of baffled that. Well, this is what happens with history, though, right? I mean, history gets tidied up, and as you said, the fairy tale is great. Even sort of our people like the fairy tale. When I first met you a decade ago at a FEE conference, I got from people who were not you, I'll just say that, some of this was the golden age of libertarianism sort of sentiment. The pre-1913, particularly maybe 1861, even more so. Like this was the golden age. So they're still telling the tales.
No, look, you get the feeling. This is really what I'm trying to correct. This historical misconception. If you talk to libertarians, a lot of libertarians, and I don't mean professional historians, but you get the idea that things were going pretty well until the New Deal. Then if you push them, they'll say, okay, yeah, maybe not the New Deal. World War I, yeah, things got screwed up in World War I. And then if you push a little harder, it's like, well, you can't forget the Progressive era. Sure, okay, the Progressive era. Then you push a little harder, and then, of course, right before that era is the Spanish-American War, so you get that. But that's about it. Okay, it doesn't go past the Spanish-American War where the empire is established, and in 1888 is the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first.
Oh no.
The first independent federal regulatory agency under the administration of Grover Cleveland, who some libertarians think was a great president.
Oh no! I didn't know that. Oh my gosh,
and income tax becomes law under Grover Cleveland.
But the first permanent income tax was what?
Well, it got struck down.
Yeah.
There was an 1894 income tax passed that gets struck down in a famous case, Pollock case. But not because the income tax on wages and salaries is unconstitutional. I have to correct people because lots of people believe this, including lawyers who teach law, who teach constitutional law. It did not. This is way off my topic now. We're way beyond my book. I would need to write a book this thick that can include this. Well, actually, I talk about it a little bit in the back. I'll do this real quickly. We should get back to the Constitution. In the 1894-95 Pollock case, Supreme Court case, did not say. In fact, it said the opposite. Did not say that taxes on wages and salaries was unconstitutional. Of course, there was an amendment, right, in 1913, and people think, well, the court must have said it was unconstitutional because why would they pass an amendment in 1913, ratifying an amendment in 1913, allowing the income tax? I'll tell you why. The bill that had the income tax on wages and salaries from 1894 also included a tax on income from real property and also stocks and bonds, so personal property and real property, income from those things. The court looked at it and said a tax on the income from property, now we're not talking about wages and salaries now, the tax on income from property is like a tax on the property itself. I'm not saying this is right, I'm just telling you what they said. It's like the same thing as taxing the property. Taxing property is a direct tax, the court said. Again, I'm not vouching for any of this. Under the Constitution, a direct tax has to be apportioned among the states according to the census. This bill did not include an apportionment clause, therefore that part of the bill is unconstitutional. But we're going to knock the whole bill out because if we if we knock out the property income tax, that would leave the full burden on wage earners, which was not the intent of Congress. Therefore, we're striking down the whole bill. But they said, we are not saying a tax on wages and salaries is unconstitutional. So the point of the amendment in 1913 was to say the court can no longer look at the source of income in ruling on an income tax. That's why the key phrase in the 16th Amendment is from whatever source derived, right? A tax on income from whatever source. That said to the justices, you can't look at the source anymore, because that's what they did in 1894 or 5. So anyway, the income tax was never unconstitutional. Most people do not know that.
Well, I learned something just now.
But
So
anyway, we're wasting too much time on a book I didn't write. That may be. Actually, I wrote a book on the income tax. That you can also find the Kindle version, which is updated from the hard copy. But that was called Your Money or Your Life. It was published by the Future Freedom Foundation. Anyway, back to the Constitution.
Right, the Constitution. That. So many informative educational tangents, and I have I've lost my way again. Something with. Well, okay. I mean, what's the point? I think. What, besides the fact that, you know, historical things are important, is there sort of an anarchist subtext you're trying to tell us here? Except for beyond simply correcting the record, more so? I mean. Well,
I mean, that wasn't the foremost point. Now, let me get back to that. My final chapter is about anarchism, and I'm proud of the chapter. It's brand new. That's not online, and I do rely on. I'm not claiming it's anything original with me. I tried to just restate and maybe to some extent flesh out some work that Roderick Long has done. But before I get to that, remind me if I forget. I did want to say something about the states. This is one of the things I forgot. You were asking about the attitude about the states. As I say in the introduction, this is not a simple melodrama, okay, with Dudley Do-Right on one side and Snidely Whiplash. Are you folks too young to know that?
No, I know that.
That was an old cartoon. Okay, this is like most history. This is not black and white. Okay, that's. If you hear a story of black and white in history, be very suspicious of it. It's going to be wrong. People are just too complicated. And I remember when I was preparing this book and doing additional research, I remember saying to a friend of mine who's a historian, very good historian, I said, I don't see how anybody writes history. People are too complicated. And it's true. There are good motives and bad motives on each side. So let me say something in defense of the Federalists for a second, at least for part of what they felt. There were abuses in the states. The state legislatures in some places, maybe many of the states, did things that libertarians would hate. They were not libertarian. They weren't guided by libertarianism. They intervened in many cases in order to provide debtor relief. They would suspend court judgments on behalf of creditors in order to help debtors. They tried to control prices in some cases. There were also, of course, they granted monopolistic corporate charters. Back then, corporate charters were not general, right? They were grants of authority, of monopolistic authority. They issued paper money, which is a complicated issue. Some of the states got in bad trouble with paper money. Some of the states didn't get in trouble with paper money. They issued paper money in a actually responsible way. Now, I'm not a fan of government fiat money, but the governments of the states, some of them, 6 or 7 of them, did it on an entirely without creating a huge amount of like runaway inflation and depressions. There was mild depreciation, but here's an interpretation of that I read a couple of books on the financial history of the U.S., and my good friend and a great historian and great economist, Jeffrey Hummel, led me to these things. The paper money, the mild paper money inflation was a form of taxation. As you know, and a lot of us call inflation an implicit tax, right? Because what does it do? It transfers purchasing power from us to the state.
Right.
In some states, they were able to keep tax rates very low, and in some cases no taxes at all, but gain their purchasing power from the mild inflation of the paper money. And that was actually preferable to people. That was preferable to a tax system. After all, don't forget, they just revolted against the British over taxation, largely over taxation. They didn't want tax men coming to their homes and confiscating their farm animals or crops because they were in arrears. this was actually a general form of taxation, and they were in favor of paper money. Lots of people were in favor of paper money in the colonies and then in the states. And so I discussed that, and it's a nuance. I hope it's a nuanced discussion. But anyway, I wanted to at least give this credit to people who thought that the states were abusive. In a lot of cases, the state legislatures could be abusive. But I say that the remedy was wrong. You don't fight abusive state legislatures by creating an overarching, all-powerful national government.
Right. You don't
that
this bully by getting a bigger bully to come and beat you up too.
Yeah, because you've now made it costly to exit. You've now cut down the competition. I think those problems would have gotten worked out through the competition among the states. Because who's going to, if you're a lender, if you want to open a bank, are you going to stay in a state that routinely, where the state legislature routinely gives debtor relief and says no, they don't have to pay you back, or we're going to change the terms of the contract so they can take a longer time? You'll go to another state. You're not going to stay in that state. And so it seems to me competition would have worked that out. Now you can see this even as a limited government person could see this, right? My argument here is not an anarchist argument. Anyway, that's why I think this requires nuance. So you're not going to find a simple black and white story here. Now, the last chapter regarding anarchism is called the Constitution of Anarchy. Mm-hmm. And I'm very proud of the title. I think it's a great title. It echoes the Constitution of Liberty, right, by Hayek. It's not the only thing that echoes Hayek. If you look at the dedication of the book, the dedication is to the constitutionalists of all parties.
I saw that.
If you've read The Road to Serfdom, he dedicated it to the socialists of all parties. Oh. So I wanted to, echo that. And some people will realize what I'm doing there. So the Constitution of Anarchy in the last chapter, I think it's 15, or maybe it's 20, I forgot how many chapters I have. And the chapters aren't very long. Again, this is not like a major commitment in your life to read this book. You can read this over a period of time, and like I said, you can jump in and out of chapters and have fun doing it without feeling, oh my gosh. And there's no footnotes, okay? I mean, I give you a sense of where the stuff is coming from, but you won't have to sit down and look at little footnotes and stuff like that. Anyway, the Constitution of Anarchy. What I argue there is we can have our freedom and a constitution too. In other words, anarchists are constitutionalists too, which goes back to the dedication, right? Because they're constitutional of all parties. And how can I say anarchism can have a constitution? Because the real constitution of a society is not what's written on parchment. Parchment doesn't make people do anything. I mean, think about it for a second. And I discussed this. When the Supreme Court strikes down a law as unconstitutional, or for whatever reason, that's like an order to the president, right? Don't enforce this law. You may not enforce this law. That's what that means, right? Why does the president listen? The Supreme Court has no troops. They can't force him to do it. They have some policemen to keep troublemakers out of the court, but why is it carried out? Or if the Congress vetoes a law by the president, that again means he can't enforce it. Why does he listen?
Well, I believe Andrew Jackson failed to listen.
That's right. But there's a good case where the exception proved the rule. When the Supreme Court said the Trail of Tears was unconstitutional, he said let them enforce it. But the exception does prove the rule. Name another case.
I don't know, but
not many. We have that Ken Davis who wouldn't issue same-sex marriage licenses in Kentucky. But it's so rare that you can name the two cases. But for the most part, they do what they're supposed to do under the law and the Constitution. And what makes them do it? The words on paper or parchment don't make them do it. How does a piece of paper make them do it? I can hand you a piece of paper saying, go eat some Jell-O. Why are you going to do that? You'll have to decide to do it if you want or not. Maybe you don't want to do it. So why do they do that? The point is that ultimately it's not coercion. Now you could say, well, if they defy it, there could be force used against them. Well, but that just sets the problem back. Let's say the marshals are sent, okay, go make the president do something or stop him from doing something. Why do the marshals listen? So it just sets the problem back, right? There's still the question of why is anybody doing anything? Ultimately, even the governmental system, no matter what kind of government it is, relies on cooperation,
Right.
not force. And cooperation means there's something internal to people and internal to the social process, the expectations, the incentives, that induce is too strong a word, that encourage people to act in those expected ways. That's true of any society. That's what we mean by society. A society is not just a mob. Society contains in the concept already some kind of order, or else we wouldn't call it a society. It was just like mob, people running around hitting each other and killing each other. And if it was Hobbes's war of all against all in the state of nature, we wouldn't call it a society. Society already implies some kind of order. It's baked into the concept. So all societies have constitutions. The Constitution being that internal implicit structure of customs and rules and expectations that describe the day-to-day routine activities that you generally see. That doesn't mean there can't be any exceptions to them, and we name two, but generally so. That's the constitution of a society, not what's on parchment. Now, the thing written down may reflect what that real constitution is, or it may not. Example, and I'm reminded of this by Roderick's article, it's a chapter from a book which I referenced. Russia had a constitution that guaranteed all kinds of liberties that were not observed in practice. So who cares what the words were? And that we can think of plenty of examples. The U.S. Constitution has things which aren't observed. Congress is supposed to declare war. That hasn't happened since what, 1941 or 2? I think Japan declared war against one of the Axis powers in 1942. So the written paper, the written words don't necessarily mean anything. On the other hand, England has an unwritten constitution. Its constitution is not written down anywhere. And yet it still has this regularity I'm referring to. Constitutions and laws or legal systems are internal. Libertarians and other people act as if the Constitution and the legal system is somehow external, imposing certain rules on people. And so if we act because this thing is like some robot or mystical, magical thing that's getting us to move in certain ways. No, it's inside us because of the incentive system and the structures of custom that may be totally unwritten, and we may never even tell us, oh yeah, that's a custom. We just may do it without thinking ever to ourselves, oh yeah, this is what we do in these circumstances. But that's nevertheless, that is a society's constitution. Now, let's take this a step further. That's true of an anarchist society. It's true of any society. So when we're arguing with a minarchist, and the minarchist says, yeah, but you can't guarantee order because you don't have a legal system and constitution, we can say, no, you're not right. We're on a level playing field now in that respect. Maybe not a moral level playing field, but we're on a level playing field as far as this constitution, this sort of, like I say, structure of incentives goes. And any system is going to depend on how people feel about it. And so just as we can imagine good and bad anarchies, right? You can imagine a stateless society where things are terrible. The same way you can imagine a stateless society where things are good. You can imagine states that are terrible. You don't have to try very hard to imagine it. Look around. And you can imagine limited governments that would be, second best to a good anarchy. In other words, not too bad. Like Adam Smith's, what does he say? Peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. That sounds, comparatively speaking, okay, that sounds pretty nice.
That's
we long for that, don't we? So the argument now is it's a level playing field between the anarchist, the natural law market anarchist, and the limited minarchist, limited government libertarian. That person doesn't have an advantage. I believe he has a moral disadvantage. But let's leave kind of morality out of this right now. He's not at an advantage to the anarchist, but he's acted as if he is. And what I try to show, again, drawing on Roderick, I'm going to give Roderick credit, is that that's not an advantage in arguing the case, because he's got to make the same kind of arguments that an anarchist, a free market anarchist, would have to make. Anyway, read the chapter. I got to leave something I got to leave you some incentive to read the book. Otherwise,
That's true.
you'd say I don't need to read it. I just heard Richman talk about it.
I'm gonna read it.
But you can ask questions.
The conversation.
And I don't mean that I don't want to say more. So feel free to ask questions, or if we're getting questions from our audience.
The people, give them a minute or two if anybody has anything. Yes, no, I'm gonna read it. Even though I just participated in this conversation and felt very uneducated, but in a positive sort of way, because it makes me excited to learn more things that I didn't know.
Look, there's a nice quotation.
Your book contains some of those things.
There's a nice quotation from a German anarchist. He wasn't a market anarchist, but his name was Gustav Landauer, and he says, and I think this is an important thing: the state is a relationship between human beings, a way by which people relate to one another. And one destroys it by entering into other relationships, by behaving differently to one another. That's very thought-provoking, and I think that's a clue to strategy. That's a clue to where we ought to be looking to come up with a strategy, because it's a way that people relate to one another. People in the government, among people in the government relating to themselves, people in the government relating to us, and are relating to them. And most of it is not the result of force. And we also know from the great work by Etienne Laboetie from 16th century, that the number of people ruled always outweighs the number of rulers. And his point was, the reason the rulers can continue in power is because there's this acquiescence. They couldn't, if they had to rely purely on force, they couldn't do it.
Right.
They don't have enough people.
But that. Then this is too large of a thing to cover in 7 minutes, but I agree, and I see what you're saying, but I feel like that sort of argument gets deeply twisted into the consent of the governed, democracy, we're all the government because we voted, etc.
No, we have I think valid answers to that.
We do indeed.
But there is a tacit acquiescence.
Yes.
Because most people
by virtue of the fact that someone is not, most of us aren't being literally forced to acquiesce most of the time directly.
Look, tax day is coming up. How many people have a gun at their heads? Now, they may feel they'll have trouble later, but on the other hand, they can't audit everybody.
Right. I'm afraid not to pay them.
And if everybody didn't pay, what would the government do? There'd be nothing they could do. There was a poll some years ago that, and I don't remember the numbers, but I remember hearing about this, that a fairly healthy percentage of people said they wouldn't pay taxes if they knew a lot of other people weren't going to pay taxes. But of course, it's the collective action problem, right? They don't want to be the first one because they may be the only one, and then they're hanging out there like, I'm out on a limb. If they knew a lot of other people were going with them, they go.
This is the problem of in so many cases. Wasn't there a couple of tax revolt movements in the 80s and the 70s, I guess? Which I think, I don't know, I've seen it mentioned in old issues of Reason, and I thought it sounded so very quaint that people would actually...
Yeah,
that's so nice.
Even in the 30s, and David Beto has written a book about this, tax revolts during the New Deal. Very interesting.
Yeah. That'd be a nice thing to make trendy again, wouldn't it?
So, apart from the historical narrative I give here, which I hope will be useful to people, I think I hope I've made it easier for anarchists to make their case to the limited government libertarians, because there's not only this tremendous literature that has poured out in the last 30 years from economists and historians and social theorists showing how anarchy not only can work but has worked throughout history. I mean, we have good empirical evidence as well as the theoretical evidence, but we have all this. We have now this theoretical point about how the anarchy as we mean it, limited government, natural law, market anarchy, contains checks and balances, contains a constitution in the real sense. I mean, and this is the point. And so the idea is not that it's not so much in Roderick Long quotes Molinari about this, Gustav Molinari, who wrote The Production of Security, really the first avowed market anarchist, although I don't think he used the word anarchist. He said we don't want to sort of abolish the government so much as just diffuse the government, diffuse it through society. So there's checks and balances everywhere. Market anarchy is the ultimate in checks and balances. It's not disposing of checks and balances. It's the ultimate checks and balances, because you have freedom of entry in the production of law and security.
I don't know about the word diffusing seems a little too gentle, but I certainly see the intended, I want to smash it, not diffuse it. But I certainly see the angle that they're going for, and the refutation of various straw men about, well, you just want to go kill people, right? Without the rules, etc. And we'd all be murdering and raping.
But all societies have rules. So the question is, which setup, anarchism or limited government, is most likely to give us good rules and reinforce good rules? When I say good rules, I mean rules of just conduct, which itself means respect for rights. So which one is? Which one is it? The minarchist thinks, well, obviously limited government, because that way we can plan the system. Look, they're central planners. Notice how it's the planning mentality. We'll have a legal system where there'll be framers and legislatures. That's central planning. Bruno Leoni, the great legal scholar of the 20th century, talked about how legislatures are like central planners. Common law, and that kind of sort of thing is much more like the market. There are parallels there. So the limited government advocate is in effect a central planner. We can plan the law properly, and that way we can be sure we get it right. Of course, we know how perverse the incentives are under a system like that. It tends not to work out. Under market anarchism, there's a disincentive to come up with bad laws. First of all, you can't tax people. So if you're going to fight with people, you have to pay all the costs. Right. You can't tax anybody, and you can't conscript anybody. And you also can't invoke the mystique of the state. Right? Oh, this is the state. We're doing this for the fatherland. No one's going to believe a private defense agency who says, "You must go to war with us for the fatherland." What fatherland? You're like a free market. You're a free market firm. Don't go to the fatherland. You mean your stockholders? And besides, violence is expensive and off-putting. You lose customers. Right. So the incentives all run in the right direction for market anarchy. For the state, they run in the wrong direction, even a state that sets out to be limited. So that's, I think, the ultimate argument.
That's a good one. That's a very good one. Man, we're out of... Josh is a trooper, and also Ken, who linked to my Playboy author page. Good job, people. They're promoting like champs.
Way to go. You have a plug to make.
I do. Speaking of sort of looking back at history that public school and such tries to square away nice and tidy like, tomorrow at 8 p.m. Unbiased America is going to talk to a dude from the Heritage Foundation. I don't know much about him, but they're going to talk about Lincoln, and I think there's going to be a little bit of the puncturing of Lincoln myths. So that could be interesting.
Yeah, that'll be good. Well, that'll be a good follow-up to this discussion, like you were saying.
It won't be as awesome, though, because they're not as awesome as we are, but they try. Bless them. Bless their conservative hearts, they try. All right, well, I'm going to read your book. Hold it up again, if you have it readily available.
There it is.
Yay!
I hope you'll read it and send me comments.
All right, America's Counter-Revolution, The Constitution Revisited by Sheldon Richman. See, real TV hosts, they say the title of the book again after when the author plugs it. Totally the thing that they do.
Oh, I didn't get to use my great line. It wasn't invented by me, but it's a great line. Enough about me. Let's talk about my book.
That is a good line. I forget. Yeah, I just thought maybe you just keep repeating that over the weeks because that's a good line. All right, so read his book, darn it, but also read his blog, Free Association, his Patreon, read his stuff at Reason, read it at Anti-War,
yes.
All that good stuff, because he's well worth reading, that Sheldon Richman.
Thank you.
Not
and
just
Lucy at Playboy and lots of other places.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to anti-war. All these politicians keep coming to my town right when I'm supposed to turn in my anti-war articles. So, but I'm gonna write one tonight, and then tomorrow I'm gonna go see Donald Trump and the crowd of people that will. I'll
No,
report.
don't hold
I'll
up a
report back.
protest. Don't hold up a protest sign because I fear for your safety.
Yeah, I'm gonna wear a flak jacket and a helmet or something. But I'll report back to all my libertarian
Yes, I want to hear
brethren
that.
and sistren about what happens.
Well, you'll have to also take it up a fortnight from now when we have our next session.
Oh yeah, indeed.
Take notes.
I wish that I could read your book immediately and I didn't have a backlog of other readings, some of which is oddly enough the Federalist Papers, because I'm going to a thing where we're going to talk about that.
Right.
But
Well, that'll be interesting.
yours is third on my to-do list, all right?
Well, try to read a little bit of mine before you go to the Fed. Read a little bit of mine before you go to the Federalist discussion, because you'll be better armed.
I will actually.
Don't forget. Remember about the Federalist Papers. They were sales pitches.
Yeah.
They were trying to sell the Constitution. They were not exactly honest. Anyway, we're over time.
All right.
And I have to go.
I got to finish eating my dinner, huh? But
Yes,
I learned a lot. This was good. Learning.
Great.
Yay. I'll see you next time.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.